letter came in a plain white envelope. No return address. Just my name in block capitals and a Norwegian postmark. One of those small round stamps from Stavanger that I hadn't seen on anything addressed to me in a long time. Inside, one sheet of paper, a photocopy of a shift log dated March 14th, 1999, folded twice, and a handwritten note, 6 words. "You were right about Bravo 6, call me." A phone number underneath, and the name Eric. I hadn't heard that name in almost 25 years. I put the letter on the kitchen table, and I didn't call for 3 days. My wife asked me on the second day what was wrong, and I told her it was nothing, just an old work thing. She said all right, and went back to her book, but she didn't turn the page for a minute or two, and I know her well enough to know what that means. She was waiting to see if I'd say more. I didn't. That was probably the first thing I lied to her about in 15 years, and I think if she's honest, she'd tell you she felt it land. I should say what I did for a living, because otherwise, none of the rest of this makes any sense. I decommissioned oil platforms. That's the term for it. In practice, my job was writing the paperwork that told other men how to shut a rig down without killing themselves. What valve to close, in what order, what to purge, what to drain, which crews stay behind on the last night to seal the wellheads, what to cut, what to leave, what to float back to shore in pieces. It sounds boring when you say it plainly, and most of it is boring. But mistakes on that kind of paperwork kill people, so you learn early to be careful with words. You learn to number every page. You learn to sign in blue ink, not black, so nobody can claim later it was photocopied. You learn to keep your own copy of everything in a filing cabinet at home, because companies get bought and sold and merged, and paper disappears. Bravo 6 was a small production platform about 140 kilometers off Aberdeen, on the eastern edge of a field that never gave us what the geologists said it would. At its peak, it had 28 crew, mostly Scots, with a few Norwegians rotating in and out on the crew boats every fortnight. The Norwegians tended to bring their own coffee. I remember that. I remember one of them saying the coffee on Bravo 6 tasted like it had been strained through a boiler sock, and he wasn't wrong. By 1997, the field was down to a trickle. The operator, a mid-sized outfit that has since been swallowed up twice and doesn't really exist anymore under that name, decided to shut it in. I was 31. Bravo 6 was the second full decommissioning I'd led on my own, and I remember being quietly proud of that, in the way you're proud of things when you're 31. And you haven't yet learned how much can go wrong. I wrote the shutdown protocol. I did the final walkthrough. I was on the last helicopter out on the 11th of November, 1998, along with the platform manager, Douglas Kerr, and Eric Sunday, who is the senior maintenance supervisor. I should say something about Eric, because he matters. Eric was in his mid-40s then, tall, thin, one of those Norwegians who doesn't quite fit in his own coveralls. Very quiet, very careful. He didn't make jokes and he didn't drink with the crew after shifts. And for the first year I worked with him, I thought he didn't like me. Then, one afternoon in the mess, he sat down opposite me and said in his slow English that he'd read my shutdown protocol for a rig in Morecambe Bay the year before, and that on page 11 I got the sequence for the flare stack wrong. and if anyone had actually followed my paperwork exactly, they'd have lost an eyebrow. Then he ate the rest of his lunch and didn't say anything else. That was Eric. He didn't scare me because he was harsh. He scared me because he noticed things nobody else noticed, and he never mentioned them until he was sure. We sealed Bravo 6 by the book. Every wellhead capped, accommodation module powered down, topside generators drained and locked out with the yellow tags. Helideck lights unbolted and crated. We left the structure standing because full removal wasn't scheduled until 2001, and in the meantime, the platform was supposed to sit out there, dark and quiet, checked once a quarter by a boat crew who'd sailed past, tick a box on a clipboard, and go home to their tea. The first call came in February 1999. I was at my desk in the Aberdeen office when the phone rang. It was a man I only half knew from the operations side, and he asked me if I remembered Bravo 6's satellite telemetry unit. I said of course I did. Every platform has one. Small transponder, tucked into a weatherproof box on the upper deck, pinging basic status data back to shore, structural tilt sensors, corrosion monitors. Nothing exciting. I told him we'd shut it down along with everything else. Eric had pulled the fuse himself. I'd watched him do it. There was a pause on the line, then he asked me if I was sure. I said I was sure. He said the telemetry unit had started transmitting again on the 17th of January. Not a full data stream, just a heartbeat. The kind of ping the unit sends when it's powered on and looking for the shore network. It had transmitted every day since, at 0600 and 1800, twice a day, for 4 weeks, never a minute early, never a minute late. I remember I laughed. That's embarrassing to think about now, but I did. I said it was probably a capacitor giving up, or a lightning strike, or salt water getting into a board and making it oscillate. I'd seen weirder things on shut-in rigs. I said it in the tone of voice you use to reassure someone who doesn't work in your field. He said quietly that he'd assumed the same thing at first. But the pings weren't drifting. They were exactly 12 hours apart to the minute. Signal strength was consistent, and the unit was reporting a stable internal temperature of 19 degrees Celsius, which was warmer than the outside air by a fair margin on a platform with no heating and no crew. I stopped laughing. He asked me if I could fly up the next morning and look at the logs. I said I could. I remember the room. Operations rooms in those years all had the same smell. Burnt coffee, cigarette smoke that had soaked into the ceiling tiles years ago and never left, and the faint chemical tang of the green screen monitors. There was a duty engineer named Fiona, and I've forgotten her surname, though I remember she wore a wool cardigan the color of oatmeal. She kept the sleeves pulled down over her hands, even when she typed. We sat side by side, and we went through the telemetry line by line. The heartbeats were exactly as he'd described. Twice a day, consistent signal, consistent internal temperature. But there was something else, and Fiona hadn't told me on the phone because she wanted me to see it fresh. Every ping carried a small data packet, a digital signature identifying which subsystem on the platform had woken the transponder up. On a live rig, that packet rotates. Different systems handshake with the transponder at different times of day. On a sealed platform, if the unit somehow woke itself up on its own, You'd expect the packet to be empty, or corrupted, or to identify only the transponder itself, talking to itself. Bravo 6's pings identified a subsystem called a CC3. I had to think about that for a second. Then I placed it. A CC3 was the access control unit for the accommodation module. Specifically, it was the electronic reader mounted on the wall next to the sleeping quarters. Men swiped their crew ID cards to go in and out. Nothing security heavy. It existed so that in an emergency, the platform manager could pull a list on his terminal of who was inside the accommodation block and who wasn't. It only fired a signal when a card was swiped. Fiona showed me the raw hex. The packet wasn't garbage, it was clean. A CC-3 was reporting a successful card read twice a day at 0600 and 1800 on a platform that had been sealed and evacuated 4 months earlier, with no power, no crew, and no cards on board. I asked her whose card was being read. She said the packet only carried a system identifier, not the individual card number. To get the card number, someone would have to physically go out to the platform, pull the ACC-3 unit's local storage, and read the internal log. She said the operator was already arranging a boat. That was on a Wednesday. The boat sailed on the 2nd of March. I wasn't on it. Eric was. They'd pulled him off a job in Bergen because he knew the platform's electrical routing better than any of the younger men, and because he was the only person who could get the ACC-3 storage board out cleanly without tripping the tamper switch. The tamper switch, if it fired, would wipe the log. So Eric went, and I stayed in the office in Aberdeen, and I waited. He was on Bravo 6 for 6 hours. He came back with the storage board wrapped in a bit of foam inside a padded case. And he came back with a face I've thought about a great many times in the years since. It wasn't fear. Eric didn't do fear the way most people do. It was something closer to the look a good mechanic gets when he opens up an engine and sees a part that should not be there. We read the log together on the 4th of March. We sat in a small meeting room off the corridor. The two of us and Fiona and a young technician from the electrical contractor. We ran the storage through a bench reader that Fiona had borrowed from another department. The ACC-3 unit had been swiped 142 times between the 17th of January and the 2nd of March. Every swipe at 0600 or 1800, every swipe on the same card. Card ID 0447. Card 0447 belonged to Callum Buchanan. Roustabout. On Bravo 6 between 1994 and 1997. He'd left in April of 1997 after a shoulder injury on a lifting job, and he'd taken a shore job with a supply company in Peterhead. He'd handed his card back when he left. That's standard. You don't leave the platform with your card. You put it in the tray at HR. They sign for it. It goes into a plastic drawer in Aberdeen with the rest of the returned cards sorted alphabetically. Callum's card should have been in that drawer. Eric and I drove to HR that same afternoon. The card was not in the tray. The tray was labeled and organized, and the gap where B ought to have been was clear. Buchanan sat between Brown and Cameron, alphabetically. Brown was there, Cameron was there, Buchanan was not. The HR administrator was a woman called Margaret. I remember her because she was very tired, and she had a small photograph of 2 grandchildren stuck to her monitor with a piece of tape that was starting to yellow. She checked her records. She told us that Callum Buchanan's card had been logged as returned on the 11th of April, 1997, and she had personally placed it in the tray. She was certain. She said she remembered him because he'd been quiet about the injury, and she'd asked him if he was all right, and he'd said he was fine and thanked her. We asked her when she'd last opened the tray. She said she opened it every Monday. Every single Monday. Because the operator was very strict about card accountability. She counted every card. She signed the count sheet. She said the count had been correct on the previous Monday, which was the 1st of March. All returned cards accounted for. No gaps. The card had been in the tray on the morning of the 1st of March. On the 2nd of March, while Eric was on the platform pulling the storage board, the card had left the office. I asked her who had access to the drawer. She said herself, her supervisor, and the security duty officer. 3 people, all of whom had been in the building all day. None of whom had touched the tray. There was no camera in the HR room. Nobody put cameras in HR rooms in 1999. There was only her word and the count sheet. Eric said something then, and I want to be careful in how I quote it, because his English was precise but not native, and I've thought about the exact words for years. He said, "This is the second time I have seen a card walk by itself." I asked him what he meant. He didn't want to talk about the first time. He said only that he had learned, long ago, not to ask certain questions out loud, because asking them tended to make things worse. I asked him what worse meant. He said, "More swipes." We didn't go to the police. What would we have said? A plastic card was missing from a drawer, and a piece of hardware was pinging from an empty platform. The operator killed the ACC-3 unit remotely by sending a shutdown command up through the satellite link. And for 11 days, the ping stopped. On the 15th of March, they came back. Twice a day. 0600 and 1800. Card 0447. That was the point at which I stopped sleeping well, because the ACC-3 unit had been physically disconnected. Eric had done it himself. He'd pulled the wiring block. He'd cut the backup battery leads with wire snips and taped the exposed ends with electrical tape. He'd photographed his work, front and back, with a small film camera the operator kept for site records. I've seen those photographs. I saw them at the time, and I saw them again in 2003, when we were closing out the archive. The unit was dead. There was no way for it to be transmitting. It was transmitting. The operator sent a second boat. 4 men this time. Eric and a specialist from the platform's original electrical contractor, a Dutchman everybody called Peter, and 2 mechanics whose names I never learned. 2 days on the platform. They found the ACC-3 unit exactly as Eric had left it. Wires cut, battery disconnected. Tape in place, the tape a little more brittle than in the photographs, but otherwise the same. No other power source connected anywhere near it. No cables running to it from anywhere. No sign that anyone had been in that compartment since Eric's boat. No footprints in the dust on the helideck. Nobody had checked for dust on the helideck. When they did, there wasn't any. That was one of the small facts that stayed with me. On a platform that hadn't been visited in weeks, you would expect a fine layer of salt dust on the plating. There wasn't one. Not on the helideck, not on the walkways outside the accommodation module. Only on the walkways further out. No disturbed seals on the accommodation doors. No signs of a boat having tied up at the boat landing. They also found something else. In the accommodation module, lower deck, bunk 14, port side second row, a laminated crew ID card, face up on the mattress. In the middle of a mattress that had been stripped down to the plastic cover before we left. Card 0447, Callum Buchanan. Eric brought that card back too. It sat on a desk in the Aberdeen office for a week. Nobody quite knew what to do with it. Nobody wanted to log it. Logging it would have meant opening a file, and opening a file would have meant escalating the whole business up to legal, and by that point, everyone involved had already sensed that legal was not a place this was going to go. Then, on the 24th of March, Margaret came in on a Monday morning to do her count, and card 0447 was back in the tray, in the right alphabetical position. Buchanan between Brown and Cameron. The one Eric had brought back was still on the desk in the other office. There were now two. I want to be very careful about how I say this next part. I've told this story to perhaps 4 people in 25 years, and each of them, at this point, has watched me with the particular patience you give to someone who's about to admit they were wrong, or that they'd misremembered, or that they'd misread something. And I've watched myself the same way. I've been through every note I still have from that period. Every photograph, every memo, every scribbled bit of paper from my filing cabinet at home. And I cannot find the mistake. I've looked for it very hard. There were 2 cards. I held them both. I laid them side by side on the desk in that office, and I looked at them for a long time. The magnetic strips read the same. The embossed numbers were the same. The plastic weight was the same. The wear on the corners was the same. And the wear on plastic ID cards is like the wear on a wedding ring. You can't fake it. It comes from years of a specific man's specific pocket. They were the same card, and one of them had walked back into a drawer that nobody had opened. We tried to reach Callum Buchanan. He'd left the Peterhead supply job in the autumn of 1998 and gone back to his family on the island of Lewis. I called the number Margaret had for next of kin. His mother picked up. I told her who I was, and I asked, as gently as I could manage, whether Callum was available. She said Callum had gone out on a fishing boat in December. The boat had been found empty, drifting about 12 miles off Stornoway. There had been a storm. He was presumed drowned. She said this in a flat, exhausted voice, the voice of a woman who had said the same sentence to a great many strangers on the phone over a great many months. She asked us please not to call again. I said I was sorry. I meant it. I still do. Callum Buchanan had been dead for 2 months when the ping started. That was when the operator shut the whole thing down. Not the platform, the investigation. A senior manager flew up from London on a Tuesday. I met him for exactly 19 minutes in a conference room on the 3rd floor. I remember the 19 minutes because I looked at my watch when he arrived, and I looked at it again when he left, out of some instinct I couldn't have named at the time. By the end of that afternoon, the ACC-3 unit had been physically removed from Bravo 6 by a crew who did not ask questions and were not introduced to me. The 2 cards had been sealed in an evidence bag and placed in a company safe, whose location I was not told, and Eric and I had both been asked, politely, to sign a document acknowledging that the events of January through March 1999 were company confidential and were not to be discussed outside the operator's offices. I signed it. Eric signed it. I don't know if the version I signed and the version he signed said exactly the same thing. That was the kind of company it was. The ping stopped because the hardware was gone. Bravo 6 was fully removed in the summer of 2002, 6 months later than planned. I was not on the removal crew. I did ask. I asked twice. The second time, the answer came from further up, and it was polite, and it was very clear. My services would not be required. The structure was cut into sections and floated to a yard in Norway and broken up for scrap. The accommodation module was cut away first, which was unusual. Normally you take the top sides down piece by piece from the outside in. The accommodation module usually goes second or third. This one went first. I saw the schedule later, and there was a note next to that line, in someone's handwriting, that said, "Priority, no other explanation." The accommodation module was demolished on the 12th of June, 2002. I got an email from Eric on the 13th of June. It said, "It is finished." I wrote back and asked him what he meant. He didn't reply. We lost touch after that, the way people do when the thing that held them together is a thing they'd both rather not think about anymore. Which brings me back to the letter on my kitchen table. I called the number in Stavanger on a Tuesday evening. Eric answered on the third ring. His voice was older than I expected, which is a stupid thing to say because of course it was. We are both older, but there's always something in you that expects the voice on the other end of an old number to be the voice from 25 years ago. He asked how I was. I asked how he was. We did the small polite dance two men do when they used to know each other and don't anymore. Then he said he had something to tell me, and he wanted to tell me on the phone because he did not want to put it in writing. He said he'd had a call 2 weeks earlier from a man he didn't know, a Norwegian marine surveyor, contracted to do a seabed sonar sweep of the old Bravo 6 field for a company that was assessing the area for a wind farm. The surveyor had been going through his sonar returns, and he'd found something on the bottom, depth of about 110 meters, roughly where the southeast leg of the platform had once stood. A small object, metallic, about the size of a shoebox, sitting upright on the sediment. The surveyor had sent an ROV down for a closer look, because the wind farm company wanted a complete seabed inventory before they started work. The ROV footage was clear. The object was an ACC-3 unit, model number visible, serial number partly readable, cables trailing from it into the mud, cut cleanly, and on the top of the unit, a small green LED was blinking. Slowly, rhythmically. The surveyor had timed it against his ship's clock. One blink every 12 hours at 0600 and 1800. Ship's time. The unit had no power source. It had been sitting on the seabed for at least 23 years. Its battery, if it had ever had one, would have been salt dead within months. No cable ran to it from anywhere. It was alone on the floor of the North Sea, in the dark, and it was blinking. Eric asked the surveyor to send him the footage. The surveyor said he would. 2 days later, he called back. He said his hard drive had been wiped clean by a power surge in his office. The backup he'd made on a separate laptop was corrupted. He couldn't recover any of it. He apologized. He said these things happened. He said he was sorry to have wasted Eric's time. Eric didn't argue. Eric never argued. He just asked the surveyor one question. He asked whether the sonar had picked up anything else in the vicinity of the unit. Any other objects, any anomalies. The surveyor was quiet for a long time. Then he said yes. About 4 meters from the unit, half buried in the sediment. The sonar had picked up what looked like a human figure, lying on its side. He said he'd assumed at first it was debris, a piece of the old platform maybe, a piece of pipework. But the ROV had gone closer, and the ROV had confirmed it. He said he was not going to put that in his report. He said he had already decided this before he called Eric the first time. He said the wind farm company did not need to know, and the police did not need to know, and nobody needed to know. Because whatever was down there had been down there a very long time, and it was not his problem to solve, and he had a mortgage. Eric agreed with him. He thanked him. He hung up. Then he wrote to me. I asked him on the phone why he was telling me this now. Why after 25 years? Why not in 2002 when the module came down? Or in 2010, or ever? He was quiet for a moment. Then he said he was 68 and he'd been given a diagnosis in April, and the diagnosis did not include another year. He said he didn't want to be the last person who remembered Bravo 6. He said he wanted at least one other person on the surface to understand what was underneath when the turbines went up and started spinning over the patch of sea. I asked him what he thought was underneath. He was quiet longer that time. When he spoke, it was in that same careful English he'd used in the Aberdeen office in 1999. He said he did not know. He said he had thought about it for a very long time, and he had never arrived at an explanation he could defend to another engineer. He said only that somewhere between the 11th of November 1998, when we lifted off Bravo 6 for the last time, and the 17th of January 1999, when the pings began, something had started clocking in for a shift that no one had assigned it. And whatever it was, he said, it had never clocked out. He said the unit on the seabed was still blinking. Twice a day. 600 and 1800. Somebody was still swiping. He said goodbye, and he hung up. I sat at the kitchen table for a while. Then I got up, and I made dinner, and I did not tell my wife anything, because there was nothing to tell that she could do anything with. Eric died in October. His daughter sent me a short email. She said her father had asked her to let me know. She said he had left instructions with a lawyer in Stavanger, and that if I ever wanted to know the location of the 2 cards, the lawyer could tell me. She included the lawyer's contact details at the bottom of the email, in a small font, almost as a footnote. I have not called the lawyer. I do not want to know where the cards are. I do not want to be in a room with them again. I've thought about writing to the wind farm company or to the Marine Authority or to a journalist, and every time I sit down to draft the letter, it reads like the ramblings of a retired engineer who has spent too many years alone with an old story. I read it back, and I can hear how it sounds. So I put the pen down, and I go and do something else. The wind farm is scheduled to begin construction next spring. The first turbines will go up in the summer. The seabed in that area will be surveyed again, more thoroughly this time, and the ACC-3 unit will almost certainly be found again. And this time, it will be found by people who have no reason to look away. I don't know what they'll do when they find it. I don't know what they'll do when they find what is lying 4 meters from it. I don't know whether the unit will still be blinking twice a day at 600 and 1800, or whether it has finally stopped, or whether it has been keeping time all these years for a reason I am not equipped to understand. I know only this. Somewhere in a safe, in an office in Aberdeen, or in a warehouse, or in a storage room whose location no one alive can now confirm, there are two identical crew YID cards belonging to a man who drowned off the coast of Stornoway in December of 1998. And I know that on the morning Eric's letter arrived, before I opened it, before I read a single word of it, I looked up at the clock on my kitchen wall. It was 6 minutes past 6, and I had the very clear feeling, sitting there in my dressing gown with the kettle just starting to whistle, that somewhere very far away, in the cold and the dark, somebody had just swiped in.